Today on this episode of High Impact Garage, we're going to talk a little bit about something that is commonly misunderstood and commonly misworked on. So we're going to talk about the front suspension on the 1980 to 82 Nissan Datsun 4x4. If you're watching this channel, like, share, and subscribe. There are a lot of things that we're trying to put out, content that's related to old Datsun pickup trucks, Z's, cars in general. We're working on it, so you bring your subscription and be notified of what we do. Let's talk briefly about the Datsun suspension that they used for the 4x4. A really brief synopsis is that in 1978, Nissan decided to go away from a kingpin independent front suspension that used short and long arms with torsion bars. They went from that suspension system that used a kingpin setup to something that was a little more conventional. It used ball joints. So the ball joint, quote unquote, ball joint suspension that Nissan used on their two-wheel drive trucks, starting with the 78 Datsun 620, that actually lasted a long time, all the way in its basic design, all the way through 2004 on the Frontier. So it's a very long-lived suspension system. Now in 1982 or 1980, when they introduced the 4x4, they used the basic components of that system to derive a 4x4 system. They wanted an independent, good riding suspension in the front on these trucks, mostly because at the time Toyota was using a solid axle, although that proved to be a very rugged way to going. Nissan wanted a more comfortable ride, and they wanted their trucks to actually handle better, because keep in mind, they were also being compared on a test track for steering and handling and capability of that nature. And so Nissan knew that they were going to be tested on these areas, and so they needed something that would have the same ride height as the Toyota, but give them the ride quality of their two-wheel drive trucks, and so they derived this suspension from their two-wheel drive. Basic suspension components between the two-wheel drive and the four-wheel drive are different. Pretty much all of it is different, with the exception of the upper and lower ball joints. Those ball joints are the same, although they were categorized as different part numbers. But today in the aftermarket, if you're buying parts, the upper and lower ball joints are exactly the same. That just has to do with the way that the aftermarket does parts. Now, keep that in mind. The lower control arms are virtually identical to the two-wheel drive lower control arms, with the exception that they changed where the lower bump stop mounting is, so that they could accommodate the CV axle. And then the upper control arms are also virtually the same, geometrically the same. However, they actually have bump stops limiting the down travel, whereas the two-wheel drive does not have that. If you come over here and look at this with me, you'll notice that the lower control arm on this system is virtually the same as the two-wheel drive. There's your upper control arm. This truck is using camber correcting upper control arms so that the camber of the tire is set correctly, and it also does place the ball joint at the proper angle. Now what they did is they left the upper control arm mount basically in the same position as on a two-wheel drive. And I say basically because it is moved somewhat in relation to what it would have been on a two-wheel drive. What they did, however, is lowered the mounting position on the frame for the lower control arm. That, by lowering that mount position down, also raised the truck up. Now, in order to accommodate that, what they did is they use a taller spindle. Now, this taller spindle design actually gives it a benefit over the later systems that use a shorter spindle, and I can explain that at another time, but basically the spindle is physically taller on the four-wheel drive than the two-wheel drive. And of course, this is where the confusion comes. And with these trucks has to do with how to service the bearings and how to service the brake rotors, which makes it a much more difficult job. When working on one of these systems, if you're doing brakes, the complicated factor is that the brake rotor is bolted to the wheel hub. But in order to pull the brake rotor off, you have to remove the brake hub, or you have to remove the wheel hub, and then unbolt these bolts out here to remove the brake rotor. This is where it becomes a very serious challenge. Over here to the brake rotor, and as you can see, here's the bolts that hold that on. The brake rotor is disassembled, is disconnected from it, so now I can pull that off. Now, this wheel bearing assembly is in a lot of ways very similar to a modern hub bearing, and a modern wheel bearing is going to have two sets of bearings that are calibrated at preset preload, and they're held together in constant tension under heavy torque together. Now this is what we're doing here, except it's, as opposed to this has to be serviced as one piece, Nissan has this serviced in individual pieces. You'll look in here and you'll notice the races, and you'll notice there's no way for the spindle to bolt to this through the center. That is because it uses a floating spindle. So as you see this right here, this wheel bearing rides on the inner race, this wheel bearing rides on the outer race. And what sets the tension is this bearing preload right here. This is extremely similar to what you would find on a pinion bearing in a rear differential. So when you're setting the tension of the wheel bearing, it's important to realize that when you're setting the bearing tension, you go to the specific torque they say, no further, and this will actually hold these two bearings apart at the right preload. As you can see right here, I'm going to take this apart. You'll notice this all comes apart. This is actually your floating spindle pin. This is the magic. This has a center section in it where the CV axle is allowed to go through, and then bronze bushings inside of it to keep the spindle, or keep the CV axle moving around, keep it centered. And then there's your spacer, your outer bearing. This pin goes through and catches on the outside edge of this bearing. So this catches the outer edge of the bearing, pulls through, and there's a spindle nut and plate on this side right here that pulls through and holds it all together. And so then once these engage with their races, then this becomes able to spin and properly do its job of providing you a rolling surface. So now that I've got this apart, you're also going to notice that this is not a 720. That's because the suspension of a 720 was put underneath this truck. There's a lot more to it. We'll talk more about it when we get a time to talk with the owner. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put the brake rotor on the hub, and then I'm going to get this up onto the truck, and I'm going to show you the process of setting up the torque on this component. So here we go. We have the brake rotor now on the hub. It's all bolted down, torqued down, and I'm going to show you guys how to get this properly torqued down. So let's watch the stack up here. So this center pin that goes through there is going to rotate with the hub, and so it needs to be fixed to the hub. So we have this plate right here which has two little tangs on it. You can see that. This plate is going to slide on right like this, and it's going to go into those two holes back in there, and that's going to hold this in position. And then there is a second plate, which is our lock plate. Now, both of these parts are no longer available from Nissan, so be careful, don't ruin them. So now this lock plate goes on, and then here is your spindle nut. The spindle nut uses a special tool, and it goes and faces forward like so. So when you go in, it's going to face forward like so. So now this is going to go down and on, and it's going to bottom out. We're going to do it by hand. want it to move through carefully. Now once we bottomed it down, then we're going to use this tool, which has 4 prongs. It locks in, and then we're going to hold that we're going to hold the hub, and we're going to torque this down. Once this nut is torqued down, then we can flop one of these over and in and lock the spindle nut. Wheel bearing torque from the service manual for 4-wheel drive is 108 to 145 foot-pounds. We're probably going to set it about 120 foot-pounds. We have the wheel bearing torque set, and we've taken and bent over one of those tabs so this isn't going to back off. The CV axle is now popped all the way through. What's the next step? The next step is to take the driven gear for the hub, pop that on, and then we're going to put this snap ring on. So snap ring is now on, and this is all in good position. It's not loose and everything. So it's time to put on the hub, the locking hub. The locking hub just goes on like so, and then it goes and gets held on by these T40 Torx bolts, which will run them down. Alright, so now we've got the brake rotor on, we have got the brake caliper on now, and I'll show you a little bit about that in a second. Now it's time to get the brake caliper compressed and the brake pads on. And before we put brake pads on, I think it's a great time to talk about the brake pads used in this system. It's similar across this brake caliper design is similar across a lot of different Datsun models, but all of the Datsun trucks 78 to 1982 are all going to have a very similar brake pad design. So I'm going to show you this. So these brake pads are this is all you got for brake pads. Now, there is a difference between the inboard pad and the outboard pad. So the outboard pad is going to have a little bump on it, if you can see that. That bump is what is used to help align it against the cradle that it's going to sit in. I will show you that in a second. The outboard pad, or the inboard, so that's the outboard pad. The inboard pad is 100% flat. The inboard piston pushes against this pad. That's about as clear as mud. Let's see this in real life. So over here on this brake caliper, now that we've got it installed on the hub, you'll notice there are 2 bolts that hold it. Yeah, they're right there. So there's 2 bolts that hold it, 2 ears that capture it. Once those ears are bolted on, then this is fixed. So this portion of the caliper is fixed and set on the spindle. This is your inboard pad. There is a piston right here that pushes directly on the inboard pad and pushes it against the brake rotor. We have this one in already, and when you're doing a brake job on these, you really don't even need to take the caliper off. You just pull, there are pins that go through here to mount and hold these brake pads in place. So you remove the pins, pull the brake pad out, and then what you can do is you actually take a pry bar and pop it in, the back side of the pry bar against the piston, and then you bend that and you actually push the piston back into the bore. Now, the way these work, you have a piston that operates by pushing directly on this brake pad. There is another piston back here. If you can see, this is the outer piston. It takes this piece, the outer ring of this, and you notice there's these bolts right here. These are your slides that this piece right here goes to. And then when that pushes out, it draws the whole thing across, and we'll actually pull this up against this brake pad, which will sit in here. So this brake pad will sit in here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to compress this side of the caliper. So now I've got this pry bar in here, and we're going to watch as that whole piece slides across and it pushes the piston in. And that's really, it shouldn't take a whole lot of effort. It should just slide all the way over. And there we go. Now we're open enough to drop the pad in, and you'll talk about that right there. This pad drops down, and you notice that that piece right there catches right here on the outboard pad. So now we're ready to put pins in, and we're ready to go. And what I'll show you the hardware and pins installed, but basically what I usually like to do, you notice this pin, it's got a little hole right there. That's going to be a capture point. These come all the way across. I'll get one pin in and locked in place, and then I'll do some work to align everything up, and then I'll get the other pin in, because there are these anti-rattle clips that are going to go up and over, and they hold, they're spring loaded and hold these brake pads in place and keep them from rattling. Now we've got all of our brake pads installed. You'll notice that our brake pads are all lined up. There are two pins that come in. I was telling about previously, they line up with the tops of the pads. And then these spring clips, they run underneath and latch over the pads. Both of those are in place. And then there are these cotter pins that clip these into place. There's actually, a lot of times there is just a spring that comes across, goes from one side to the other. It all depends on the hardware that you may have on your truck, because the aftermarket did vary it. There you have it. That is how you do brakes on a 1980 to 82 four-wheel drive type front suspension. Obviously this is not an 82 or 81 or 80 4x4 Datsun, but that is the suspension right there off of an 80, 81, and 82 Datsun 4x4. The brake rotors are all now fully installed on here, and it's going to do well as far as braking, you know, as long as it's maintained and handled properly. So if you have any questions at all, feel free to leave a comment in the thing below, and we will be putting out more content as expected. This is stuff we do every day, and if you ever have any questions, feel free to ask us. This is Patrick with High Impact Motorsports at High Impact Garage.